As you may know, the Cold War began to end in the late 80s with the Berlin Wall collapsing in 1989 and the Soviet Union dissolving in 1991. This was monumentous. The world was clearly changing. The USSR had lost and the United States had won. The only question was, what exactly would change? To answer this question, the entire international relations profession stood up and started to give their hot takes. Here I will discuss 3 of these hot takes and why each of them were wrong. Francis Fukuyama's claim that history would end, Sam Huntington's argument that the world would turn into a clash of civilizations, and John Mearsheimer's prediction that Europe would go back to being a hotbed of conflict. So let's start off with Fukuyama. In 1989, he wrote The End of History, with a big question mark at the end. This paper probably takes the prize for being the most widely misinterpreted piece in all of political science. Most people believe that Fukuyama said that history was over, that democracy had won, and that really soon all war would end and nothing would ever happen again. That was not Fukuyama's argument. Instead, Fukuyama was making a bit of a weird philosophical claim. The fact of the matter is that the USSR, which was about to collapse, was a communist state, and the Marxist ideology was based on argued that history had a direction. We would start off with primitive societies, evolve into slavery, feudalism, capitalism, and eventually socialism/communism. Fukuyama was arguing that with the fall of the USSR, that worldview was proven wrong. Indeed, history would tend to the victory of liberal democracy, systems like we have in the US and the Western world in general. He was in fact not saying that history was already over, but that societies would not evolve past liberal democracy after they reached it. This was the end game. He further argued that this would eventually, though not yet, guarantee peace on the planet, and the society would get so bored of everything that history might get restarted. So it's a weird piece. Fukuyama was probably wrong, but not because wars exist. He was probably wrong because there's no grand quasi-religious reason why things have to happen this way. And that is what he believed. Next up, everyone's favorite, Samuel Huntington. His piece titled Clash of Civilizations is so popular that it's actually the second most assigned political science paper according to the Open Syllabus Project, eclipsing Machiavelli, the Communist Manifesto, and more. The paper is really dumb. Okay, not really, but it is. Huntington's argument is that the Cold War was a battle of different ideologies, capitalist democracies versus communism. As that ended, we would now enter a world where conflicts would be defined not by ideology, but by civilization. For example, the US and other Western countries clearly constituted a separate civilization. Another one was something like a Muslim civilization consisting of the Arab states, Iran, and Northern Africa. And there was also a Chinese civilization and a Japanese one. It got really weird really fast. The paper was somewhat interesting, but it got propelled to a lot more fame than it deserved because of 9/11. People were like, oh my god, it's the West versus Islamic terrorism. We can see that's faded away by now and the world has weird alliances that Huntington would not predict, like Japan and the US against China, or China and Russia against the United States. Huntington's thesis still holds sway over international relations undergrads, but it's ultimately stupid because we have a lot of data showing that intra-civilizational conflict is more common than inter-civilizational conflict. Sorry Sam, you're wrong. Last but not least, John Mearsheimer's piece, Back to the Future, also published under the name Why We Will Soon Miss the Cold War. Mearsheimer basically argued that the Cold War was a time of peace in Europe because the US, with the help of NATO, and the Soviet Union, with the Warsaw Pact, had split the continent between 2 security structures. As the Cold War ended, he thought both the US and the USSR/Russia would pull their troops out of Europe. As a result, countries would no longer have their security guaranteed. He thought that this would then lead to Germany looking over at France and going, hey, that's a nice Alsace-Lorraine you got there. It would be a shame if somebody grabbed it, and you would get World War III. Or, in a nicer scenario, everybody would get nukes. Either way, things were going to look scary. But the basic prediction of the paper was that conflict would return to Europe and the continent would look the way it did before the Cold War. This also did not happen, but Mearsheimer was probably more right than the other two. His mistake was that NATO did not collapse and the US kept its troops in Europe. This ensured peace throughout the places where NATO was involved. On the other hand, if you look at places like Georgia and Ukraine, the lack of US military involvement meant that Russia was aching for war and went for it. Yugoslavia is another good example. Neither the US nor Russia had troops there, so it broke up with President Milosevic massacring Bosnians. It was eventually forced to stop by, you guessed it, NATO. So there you go. 3 papers from 3 eminent political science professors trying to predict the world after the Soviet collapse. All 3 were dead wrong. The lesson here is quite simple. Making predictions is hard, especially about the future. This video was made possible with help from the University of Georgia, bringing quality education to Georgia and beyond.